6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Click that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you. She's only teasing. Go on. He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like.
Absolutely.
On Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
Good afternoon, welcome to Real Britain with me, Emily Carver, on TV, online and digital radio. Now, we have got lots to come up on the show this afternoon. The row over Gary Lineker's suspension from Match of the Day continues as more sports presenters and pundits stand in solidarity with the star and stand down from their hosting duties. The former Director General of the BBC says the corporation has undermined its own credibility. So our question of the day is, was the BBC right to remove Gary Lineker from Match of the Day over his tweets? Also, if you're a Twitter user, you may have seen that a certain GB News presenter, Patrick Christys, threw his hat in the ring last night to host Match of the Day himself. We'll be speaking to him a little bit later. Plus, we'll be talking about where the row all started, really, the small boats crisis. Yesterday, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak attended the first Anglo-French summit in 5 years, promising even more money to France. But I want to know, do you think giving £500 million to the French will make the blind bit of difference? Plus, we'll be talking about politics from across the pond and which president would be best for the UK. All this and more, but first, it's the news with Ray Addison.
Thanks, Emily. It's 1 minute past 2. Here's the latest. The BBC is experiencing a mass boycott by its sports presenters. It comes after Gary Lineker was forced to step back from Match of the Day over a tweet criticising the government's migration policy. The show will go ahead tonight, but Alan Shearer and Ian Wright have backed out. Meanwhile, the BBC has cancelled today's Football Focus and Final Score after presenters Alex Scott and Jason Mohammed said they won't appear. 5 Live has also seen walkouts. Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer says the corporation has made a bad decision.
The BBC is not acting impartially by caving in to Tory MPs who are complaining about Gary Lineker. They've got this one badly wrong, and now they're very, very exposed, as is the government, because at the heart of this is the government's failure on the asylum system. And rather than take responsibility for the mess they've made, the government is casting around to blame anybody else, Gary Lineker, the BBC, civil servants, the Blob. What they should be doing is standing up, accepting they've broken the asylum system and telling us what they're going to do to actually fix it, not whinging.
The Chancellor has told GB News he wants Britain to have the most competitive business tax rates amid calls to scrap a planned hike in corporation tax. Ahead of Wednesday's spring budget, Jeremy Hunt spoke to Esther McVeigh and Philip Davis on his plans to deliver growth and tackle inflation. He said the corporation tax increase from 19 to 25% would still leave the UK with a lower rate than nearly all major rivals. But he also said he was committed to previous promises of bringing down corporation tax.
What we now have is a responsible outlook for public finances. The markets have recognised that by bringing down mortgage rates, interest rates, and we're on track to bring inflation down. But if you're saying to me, as a Conservative Chancellor, do I want to bring down taxes? Well, I want to bring down personal taxes because that is at the heart of what being a Conservative is. But I want to bring down business taxes even more.
Junior doctors say they have no choice but to strike on Monday after the Health Secretary failed to attend talks on Friday. It comes after Steve Barclay said he wanted them to call off a planned 3-day walkout and negotiate. Nearly 40,000 junior doctors belonging to the British Medical Association voted to take industrial action. They're demanding a 35% pay rise and warn that future strikes could last longer than 72 hours. NHS England says more than 100,000 patients have been treated in virtual wards over the last year. The patients stay in their own homes whilst receiving treatment and have their vital signs monitored remotely. Medical bosses say the scheme has been a game changer, helping patients to avoid unnecessary hospital trips and enabling them to be discharged sooner. A man has been arrested under the Terrorism Act after the new IRA claimed responsibility for the shooting of Detective Chief Inspector John Caldwell. It follows the search of a property in the Londonderry area. Police say the 25-year-old will also be questioned over a hoax security alert. Earlier, a typed message was posted on a wall in Derry claiming responsibility for Mr. Caldwell's attempted murder. He remains critically ill in hospital after being shot several times in Omagh. Silicon Valley Bank UK says it will be put into insolvency from tomorrow night. It comes after its parent company in America was put under US government control, becoming the biggest failure of a US bank since the 2008 financial crisis. The Bank of England says it will stop SVB from making payments or accepting deposits. However, customers can be paid up to £85,000 from the Deposit Insurance Scheme. And Tom Hanks has been named Worst Supporting Actor at the 2023 Razzie Awards. Now, a warning for those watching on TV, the following footage contains flashing images. The Oscar-winning actor was chosen for his depiction of Colonel Tom Parker in the movie Elvis. His portrayal of Presley's former manager was described by judges as cruel, and they also criticised his character's latex face. The awards honour poor performances in Hollywood movies and are held a day before the Oscars on Sunday. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens. Now let's get back to Emily Carver.
Thank you, Ray. Welcome to Real Britain. So here's what's coming up on the show this afternoon. Has the Gary Lineker row got a bit ridiculous now? Every pundit under the sun seems to be standing down in solidarity. Is this all a spectacular own goal for the BBC, or have they done the right thing in suspending the very vocal pundit? Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has promised more money, nearly £500 million of it, to France and claims relations between the two countries are improving. But will this solve the small boat crisis? Plus, is the Prime Minister right to bring forward the review into what's being taught in some schools as fact? After the chief of the UK's education watchdog came out to say that some of the content used in sex education lessons has no scientific basis. That's what we're talking about for the next hour. I'd love to know your thoughts on all of today's topics. As always, please do tweet me at GBNews, or you can email me on gbviews@gbnews.uk. You can also watch us online too on YouTube. Stay tuned. So, sports pundit Gary Lineker has plunged Britain into yet another culture war. Whether you #stand with Gary or think the BBC was absolutely right to suspend the Match of the Day presenter for his inflammatory tweet has become the question of the day. Here's a reminder of the offending remarks. There is no huge influx. We take far fewer refugees than other major European countries. This is just an immeasurably cruel policy directed at the most vulnerable people in language that is not dissimilar to that used by Germany in the 30s. And I'm out of order? That's what he had to say. So, as a result of this historically illiterate, perhaps, and rather offensive tweet, all hell has broken loose. Mass boycotts have left the BBC's sports programming in tatters. Sporting legends Ian Wright and Alan Shearer have pledged their allegiance to the MOTD host, refusing to take part on the show. Mark Chapman, Colin Murray, Alex Scott, Kelly Summers and Jason Mohammed are also on strike. Fans of Football Focus and Final Score have been left with repeats of Bargain Hunt and The Repair Shop. Even Fatboy Slim took the opportunity last night to beam Gary's face on stage to his adoring fans, like some kind of memorial. As a result, Match of the Day will now be aired with no presenters, no pundits, and no commentators. It's a bit of a farce. I think it would have been rather nice, actually, for Lineker to encourage a lesser-known pundit to take the reins. What an opportunity. Instead, he's reportedly been left in tears, overwhelmed by all the support he's received from his fellow football pundits. So, you're either on Gary Lineker's side or you're not. it's highly likely that anyone who dared to put themselves forward to present the show tonight would be hounded out by the industry, shamed and ridiculed. Who would want that? There are a few things here for me, though. Firstly, was drawing parallels to language used in Nazi Germany in the 30s historically illiterate, and if so, offensive enough to warrant his suspension? 2, is this a freedom of speech issue, or is this a simple story of man breaks contract and faces the repercussions? 3, if he's technically a freelancer, should it matter what he tweets? Or does the fact he's practically the face of the BBC and owes his 8.6 million strong following largely to the broadcaster change this? The BBC's guidelines certainly think so. Fourthly, where does the BBC go from here? Clearly, they're failing to apply their impartiality guidelines fairly. If Gary is suspended, should Alan Sugar, for example, be suspended too for coming out against strike action? So, in my view, it comes down to this. The BBC needs to decide what impartiality means and apply their rules equally, even-handedly and without favour. Oh, and a final thought. What happens if the match of the day is unaffected by the absence of Lineker and friends? Say the viewing figures remain unchanged or don't fall dramatically tonight. Would the BBC reconsider the 6- and 7-figure salaries they dish out and ponder whether they are value for taxpayer money? Right, there are various angles we can go at this story on, but joining me now is GB News reporter Jack Carson, who is live from BBC HQ. Jack, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon on Real Britain. What's the very latest on this hot story?
Well, the past 24 hours have just been changing, with more people coming out with comments, more organisations saying they're going to boycott Match of the Day, such as the PFA, the Professional Footballers Association, said that the Premier League has informed all of the 12 clubs playing today that they won't have a requirement to do any of the Match of the Day post-match interviews with players and management, and that the PFA was going to stand by all of their players when they don't complete those broadcast requirements. Ian Wright, after, of course, saying he stood in solidarity with Gary Lineker, has said that he will quit the BBC if they get rid of him. And just moments ago, as you would have heard in the bulletin, Keir Starmer's also commented, saying that the BBC have got this one badly wrong, and now they're very, very exposed. The Government Department for Culture, Media and Sport has said that the individual cases are a matter for the BBC, but we also know that part of the Common Sense group of MPs, a backbench group led by Sir John Hayes, 36 of those have all signed a letter demanding an apology from Gary Lineker, and that's where this whole row stems from, because yesterday afternoon it looked like Match of the Day today would go ahead as planned, but above BBC Sport, within the hierarchy, it's thought a meeting took place between them and Gary Lineker, where they told him that he was going to have to step back unless he made a public apology, an announcement essentially which sources close to Gary Lineker say would have caused him a humiliation. And so today he himself has gone to the Leicester City football game, and the sports programming for the BBC has been left completely in tatters, essentially, with Football Focus and Final Score both cancelled because of those boycotts from the other reporters standing with him.
I mean, it is a bit of a disappointment for football fans to see that Football Focus and the other one, which I've forgotten, have now become repeats of Bargain Hunt and the Repair Shop. Thank you very much for standing out there by the BBC HQ. That is Jack Carson, our news reporter there. So, has the BBC scored a bit of an own goal here? Have they handled this badly? Or could the state broadcaster actually gain some support for their decision? Joining me now to discuss this is Francis Foster, comedian and host of the Trigonometry podcast. Thank you very much for joining us, Francis. And Peter Edwards here, the former editor of the Labour List website. Right, Francis, there are so many angles to this story. I'll ask you the basic question first. Was the BBC right to take this action against Gary Lineker?
Well, the BBC was unfortunately put in an incredibly difficult position, because the BBC's remit as a public state broadcaster is to be impartial and neutral. And I think we can all agree, left, right and centre, that Gary Lineker's comments were anything but neutral. And the thing that made it particularly difficult for the BBC is the inflammatory nature of Gary's tweets comparing Suella Braverman, who I'm no fan of, particularly more for her incompetence than anything else, to 1930s Germany. So they were put in an incredibly difficult position. And the ensuing Twitter storm meant that they had to act quickly. And to be honest with you, I'm not sure in the circumstances what else the BBC could have done.
Fair enough, Peter. The Keir Starmer has come out today to say that the BBC was wrong and that essentially they let Conservative politicians influence their decision. Do you think that's true?
I think there's truth to that, yeah, absolutely. But also I think it's bigger than party politics. So I think, first of all, Gary Lineker, used the language of the 1930s. I would not have used that. I don't think that's the right language to compare Suella Braverman to Nazis at all. But given where we are, I think the BBC are guilty of hypocrisy because there's a Conservative donor as BBC chair, yet the BBC is preaching impartiality. But they're also guilty of great inconsistency because Gary Lineker has been making political tweets for several years, whether they're about Brexit or immigration or asylum. So to act now, when they haven't acted on all the other political tweets, is incredibly inconsistent.
But is this just not the straw that broke the camel's back? Because they have had words with him. Previous Director Generals of the BBC have had to sit him down for a chat or two about his social media use. Is this just not an escalation, the final straw? Because some companies, you might be sacked for tweeting something like that anyway for the offence.
Well, that's a good point, because in what you might call an ordinary workplace, a shop or an office, if you do something wrong, you get sent to HR or have a disciplinary procedure, whereas Gary Lineker does seem to have been on the receiving end of various chats for several years, yet and although I think he's right to oppose the Tory government policy, he did break the rules. I have a lot of sympathy with him personally, but I think the BBC have been both hypocritical and inconsistent.
Yeah, fair point. Francis, in terms of what I find interesting, and it's probably quite predictable, is how this has sort of snowballed and how we've now got every sports pundit under the sun now coming out in solidarity, #I stand with Gary. What do you make of all that?
Well, I'll be honest with you, Emily. Everyone's on strike at the moment, so why not match of the day?
There you go.
Why should the BBC football pundits decide to unionise? The real issue, I think, with this is what we're actually talking about here isn't not Gary Lineker. It's not football. It is what is the role of the BBC moving forward. Because the BBC, particularly when it comes to their output, with their culture, their arts, their society, their comedy, they have shown a left-wing bias, a complete left-wing bias, to the point where if you are right of centre and you are in the arts, the chances are you're not going to get platformed, you're not going to get a chance, your voice is not going to be heard. So that being the case, more and more people have become more and more disillusioned with the BBC, and this is the moment when it's all actually exploded. And what Gary Lineker has done is just sent out an ill-thought-out tweet, but he's inadvertently stepped on a landmine that has been waiting to explode for many years. And that's actually what we're talking about here.
Yeah, I mean, it's not looking great for the broadcaster. How they managed to clean this one up, I'm not sure. But Peter, doesn't this come down to their impartiality rules? Surely they have to be applied fairly, even-handedly, without favour, across the board. And yes, you could say that too about the likes of Andrew Neil and Alan Sugar, who have been vocal with a different political view.
Well, yeah, and I think it comes down to the BBC not knowing what they mean by impartiality, both in terms of senior management, where you've got the chair who's donated to the Tory party, and if memory serves me right, Tim Davie, the Director General, was very briefly 30 years ago a Conservative candidate. Then you've got working journalists day to day. The BBC are confused about whether they're freelance people or whether they're on payroll and subject to normal workplace regulations. So I think the BBC need to clarify that, because we're back into yet another BBC crisis and these things pop up. But the other point I'd make very briefly about BBC crises is every government falls out of the BBC. Mrs Thatcher and Bernard Ingham, her press secretary, who passed away very recently, they got sick of the BBC at times. Tony Blair, of course, various points, David Cameron, Boris Johnson, the Tories now.
The list goes on.
Governments fall out with the national broadcaster.
Yeah, they do. And I'm sure, remember, Jeremy Corbyn and his fans were very angry with the way he was dealt with, wrongly or
They're always
rightly.
angry.
Francis, just finally, is the answer to this whole thing to scrap the licence fee? Then they don't have to abide by impartiality rules, and then no one can really have a go.
Look, I think that is inevitably what is going to happen. The BBC, I have a lot of love and affection for, particularly the content and the programmes that they used to create. The reality is, as we move forward into the 21st century, and we have Netflix and all the other providers, the BBC is just going to have to compete with them, and it's not realistic and it's not sustainable to demand that everybody pay a licence fee for this organisation, which more and more does not represent the average person.
Very, very quickly, Peter.
Oh, no, you should keep the BBC as it is. It's got to be a bit smaller, spend a bit less, but I'm in favour of plurality. So you have GBNews, a start-up, Sky News, a massive corporation, both, free market models, and a state broadcaster, Channel 4 sitting somewhere in the middle. It's good to have a mix.
Well, you never know, they might be able to cut back on their staffing costs if Gary Lineker, well, if Match of the Day without Gary Lineker does equally as well tonight, but we'll have to wait to see the viewing figures from that. Thank you very much indeed, Francis Foster, and former editor of Labour List, Peter Edwards, here with me in the studio. We have a statement from the BBC. They say, the BBC has been in extensive discussions with Gary and his team in recent days. We have said that we consider his recent social media activity to be a breach of our guidelines. The BBC has decided that he will step back from presenting Match of the Day until we've got an agreed and clear position on his use of social media. When it comes to leading our football and sports coverage, Gary is second to none. We have never said that Gary should be an opinion-free zone or that he can't have a view on issues that matter to him, but we have said that he should keep it well away from taking sides on party political issues or political controversies. I'm not sure how you square that circle. Tune into GBNews tonight from 10 p.m. to watch our star-studded Match of the Day alternative with Mark Dolan. We'll be hearing more about that later on in the show. But after the break, we'll be discussing the issue that has sparked the whole Lineker row, the small boats crisis. Let's get back to the policy. But first, let's have a look at the weather.
Hello there, I'm Greg Dewhurst and welcome to your latest broadcast from the Met Office. We'll see rain and hail snow pushing northeastwards through the next 24 hours or so, turning breezy, but mild air is returning from the Atlantic. And we can see that in the bigger picture. We can see the oranges and yellows starting to creep in from the southwest, the blues being shunted away as we head through later Sunday into the beginning of next week. But does it last? Well, we'll see in the outlook. Through the rest of Saturday evening, we can see that band of rain across parts of Northern Ireland into northern England, pushing its way north and east, with some hail snow possible across the Pennines up into the mountains of Scotland. Met Office warnings in force for snow and ice, perhaps up to 10 centimetres over the Scottish mountains. Some icy stretches here, but that mild air starting to move in from the southwest of 5 to 7 by Sunday morning. But it is a dry picture to start Sunday across much of England and Wales. We see some sunny spells. Early rain will clear the northeast of Scotland to allow brighter skies for a time, before then thicker cloud and outbreaks of rain move in here for the afternoon, also across Northern Ireland, where the rain could be heavy at times, and then later on in the day some further rain coming into parts of Cornwall. A mild day for everyone, 12, 13, 14 degrees by Sunday afternoon in the best of any sunnier breaks. It does turn wetter and windier through the evening, though, on Sunday as bands of weather systems move in, this rain turning heavy at times, particularly across southern parts of Scotland into Northern Ireland. Too, the wind starting to pick up. Irish Sea coasts could start to see gales by Monday morning, but a very mild night. Temperatures 9, 10, 11 Celsius, so any lying snow over the hills will melt quite quickly. Then into Monday, we'll generally see an unsettled day for many. There'll be outbreaks of rain pushing eastwards across England and Wales, some very strong winds, gales around the coast. Rain across Northern Ireland, southern Scotland, falling as snow over the high ground here. So some cold air nearby, outbreaks of rain, but for most it will be mild on Monday. Before then, that cold air returns to everyone by Tuesday.
Here on GB News Live, we'll be keeping you in the picture, finding out what's happening across the country and finding out why it matters to you. We'll have the facts fast with our team of reporters and specialist correspondents. Wherever it's happening, we'll be there from 12 noon on TV, radio and online. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, no, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to Real Britain on GB News. Now, the question of the day has been, was the BBC right to remove Gary Lineker from the match of the day over his tweets? I want to know your views. But we're going to go back to the policy that kicked this all off, the migrant policy, of course, the illegal immigration bill. So yesterday, during an Anglo-French summit in Paris, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak announced that Britain will pay France nearly £500 million over the next 3 years to step up efforts to prevent small boats from crossing the Channel. The Prime Minister praised the unprecedented £478 million package to fund a new detention centre in France and hundreds of extra law enforcement officers on French shores. So joining me now to discuss this is Stephen Wolfe, Director at the Centre for Migration and Economic Prosperity. Stephen, this is a lot of money we're going to be giving to the French. Do you have faith that this will, well, do what it's intended to?
Well, we can only keep our fingers crossed and hope that this time £500 million is actually going to help stop the boats coming across, because we've already spent 250 million in that, and so it will be £750 million that we've given to the French in 9 years. It's a substantial amount of money, and of course, we have to include the money that we have spent on our own, Oriel and I, the Border Agency and the Navy, which is also running about £250 million a year. So to stop the boats, it is generally costing us £750 million every year to protect our borders, and they're still coming.
Right. Well, I was wondering whether, so apparently, according to reports, there will be 3 instalments over the years of this money.
Yeah.
I was thinking that it should be pegged to performance, because it seems like it hasn't been in the past. So, for example, if we give them the first lot, which is 124 million in the next year, OK, if they do a good job, we'll then give them their second instalment in 2024, which will be £168 million. Surely that's the way to go.
Well, of course, in every public procurement programme that we have and contracts, there are these clauses that say if you fail to build on time, unless, of course, you're HS2, where we'll just keep giving you more and more money. So it would be a brilliant idea, Emily, if they turned around and said for every illegal Channel migrant that gets into a boat and slips through and has to be picked up by our Navy, then we should deduct £1 million or £2 million per person. I think that might incentivize them, but these are the French, and let's imagine what the French would say. They would still carry on ignoring us until we paid them up. They've done a brilliant deal. Macron is a massive negotiator on this. He managed it with Priti Patel. He got 65 million from her when she was Home Secretary. And I think at the end of the day, we just got to hope and pray that when they say that the French are also going to put in 4 times as much, that a number of drones, that a number of police officers, the border agency, border forces, this time they will actually stop the boats. But I question this for you, Emily. If they stop coming over the boats, they're going to start coming back into the backs of lorries and other ways as well.
Well, there is that. Do you think Macron smells a little bit of desperation in Rishi Sunak? Obviously, Rishi's got this very controversial bill that has led to, well, meltdown at the BBC, at least, in one way or another. He's got this very controversial bill. This, of course, cooperation with the French is another prong in his pronged approach to stopping the boats. Do you think he smells a bit of desperation? Do you think perhaps we haven't got the best bargain with the French?
I think he knows that this is a major political issue for Rishi Sunak, not only for the politics of the north of England and the Midlands, where people are crying out to have this stopped and so that they could vote for their own Conservatives again. And the red wall is really important. But more importantly for Macron as well, it's the perception that he can now be seen to lead the European Union on immigration and asylum, when so much of the kind of politics of Europe has been lost to Meloni in Italy, and of course what's been happening in Sweden and Denmark. And he wants to be seen as the liberal, fair and balanced person dealing with this particular issue. And I think he's going to use this as a stepping stone, not only in his own country, but also to make this Macron's EU.
Yes, and just lastly, but while we've got you, I want you to answer our question of the day. Was the BBC right to suspend Gary Lineker over his tweets?
Well, absolutely. There is a balance that's to be made. You saw the BBC's own particular statement that said they have political guidelines. Clearly, Gary Lineker went offside and shot past the net and missed. And I saw him do that many times for England, I'm afraid. I never really understood this glorification of this particular striker who never really won a World Cup for us, did he? But he's made millions out of it. I doubt very much that he's going to be overly offended. But I would actually say this, that's really quite interesting. All of those stars that have actually gone alongside him and said, we're not going to perform. Well, there's people like me and you, we could do BBC. I'd love to go off and do the match of the day, and I bet there's lots of other footballers that say, OK, sack them, I'll take their job instead.
Well, it's funny you say that, because GB News is having its own alternative Match of the Day programme this evening on Mark Dolan's show. So I'm telling you, stay tuned for that. And to our viewers, of course, please do stay tuned for that this evening. That's Stephen Wolfe. Thank you very much for joining us on Real Britain this afternoon. He is, of course, the director of the Centre for Migration and Economic Prosperity, and does not stand with Gary, it seems. You're with GB News on TV and DAB radio. After the break, we'll be returning to that story, the one that everyone is talking about today, Gary Lineker. Are you team #IStandWithGary? Or do you think the BBC have done the right thing in suspending him? Please do keep sending in your views. We're getting lots in. But first, let's get a check on the news headlines with Ray Addison.
Thanks, Emily. Good afternoon. It's 31 minutes past 2. Here's the latest. The BBC has apologised and said it's working hard to resolve the situation after experiencing a mass boycott by its sports presenters. It comes after the broadcaster forced Gary Lineker to step back from Match of the Day over a tweet that was critical of the government. The show will go ahead tonight, but Alan Shearer and Ian Wright have backed out. Meanwhile, Football Focus and Final Score were cancelled after Alex Scott and Jason Mohammed said they won't appear. The Chancellor has told GB News he wants Britain to have the most competitive business tax rates amid calls to scrap a planned hike in corporation tax. Ahead of Wednesday's spring budget, Jeremy Hunt spoke exclusively about his plans to deliver growth and tackle inflation. He said the increase from 19% to 25% would still leave the UK with a lower corporation tax rate than nearly all major rivals. And a 25-year-old man has been arrested under the Terrorism Act after the new IRA claimed responsibility for the shooting of Detective Chief Inspector John Caldwell. It follows the search of a property in the Londonderry area. Police say the man will also be questioned over a hoax security alert. Mr. Caldwell remains critically ill in hospital after being shot several times in Omagh. We're on TV, online and on DAB+ radio. This is GB News. Don't go anywhere. Real Britain will be back. Just a moment.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference. And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you. She's only teasing. Go on. He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, The People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, The People's Channel. Britain is watching.
Right, welcome back to Real Britain on GB News TV, online and digital radio. So back to our top story of the day, the suspension of Gary Lineker from Match of the Day over his tweets. For this next segment, I'm asking, was the BBC pressured by the right-wing media and some Tory MPs to suspend Lineker? And if so, is this right or wrong? Joining me now in the studio is David Oldroyd-Bolt. Thank you very much indeed for joining me. So
Thanks.
What do you make of this all? You said perhaps a storm in a teacup, or do you think there's something a little bit, well, what's the word for it? A little bit uncomfortable about the fact that Tory MPs did seem to be almost lobbying the BBC to, well, sack Gary.
Well, I think it's a hypocritical situation. It's just what the left does all the time. It's just the tables have been turned in this instance. Gary Lineker is paid a vast amount through a poll tax. We have no option whether or not we pay him. If we have a television, we're paying him. Therefore, I think it's perfectly reasonable that he must abide by the BBC's code of conduct, which requires that he doesn't express political views in a public forum, which he did. It's absolute sophistry to say that just because he was not doing it in his job, as it were, because he didn't sit on Match of the Day and make the comments he made about the government policy, that he shouldn't be punished or that he shouldn't be censured. He should be. It's a very, very clear code of conduct. And I think that those who are coming out in support of, in solidarity with Lineker, are being desperately hypocritical. There have been many, many people over the course of particularly the past 10 or 20 years who would not get away with what he's got away with were they coming at it from a different point of view, were they coming at it from a conservative point of view.
Well, I'm not sure if we can say that completely, because, of course, Andrew Neil,
who I think was always
in a personal
scrupulous.
Capacity, tweeted things and wrote things and all sorts. Also, Alan Sugar came out against the strike action, against Mick Lynch, etc., etc. These are all political things, and it seems confusing to me that the BBC guidance says that he can't talk about party political issues or political controversies, but he can have an opinion on issues that matter to him. So how do you square that?
I don't think you should square it. I think it should be straightforwardly that anybody who's a BBC contractor or employee, as he is, should not be expressing political views in a public forum while they're taking our money. And let us reiterate the point that we have no choice whether or not we pay for this. If you were working for Channel 4 or Sky or whomever, you have a choice whether or not you use those services. Fine, Channel 4 is part public, but let's say for the moment you have that choice. With the BBC, you have not that choice. We are compelled by force of law and with threat of imprisonment to pay his salary.
That's very true. Well, we have Nigel Nelson here with us too, political editor of the Sunday Mirror and Sunday People, zooming in. Thank you very much, Nigel. What do you think? Keir Starmer has sort of suggested that the BBC gave in to Tory MPs and their complaints.
Yes, I think they did. And the whole point here is that if you go back to Gary Lineker's original tweet, quite clearly he went too far, that there's no question that the language of 1930s Germany is being used at the moment. It's not. So the issue was not that Gary Lineker had an opinion, which the BBC acknowledges he is entitled to do, is that the opinion became terribly extreme. If he'd left his tweet by simply saying that the small boat policy was cruel and hit vulnerable people, that would have been fair comment. He went too far by making a comparison with Nazi Germany. What should then have happened is the row should have been cooled down rather than stoked up. So the BBC should have had a quiet word with him, try to resolve the issue about not doing such things again. Instead, they pour petrol on the fire, and it explodes now into an argument about free speech.
But Nigel, sorry to interrupt you, but haven't the BBC already done that with him several times? They've already had him and gave him a slap on the wrist.
Well, I mean, there was obviously a conversation with him and his representatives after he had tweeted. We don't know the result of that conversation. The point I'm making is what the BBC shouldn't do is then suspend him and make a bad situation worse. And as far as I can see, they've caved in to pressure from the government because the government love this. It's distracting completely from the policy itself.
David, do you think there's you seem to take the view that this shows that basically people should not be paying for the BBC in the way that they do now? Do you think this has ignited yet another row about how the BBC is paid for?
It would be a consummation devoutly to be wished, but unfortunately I don't think it will be, because the government will always run away from that debate because they know how much entrenched opposition there is to it. I take absolute issue with Nigel saying that it was fair comment in the first instance, or it would have been fair comment to say that this is a terrible policy. It is not the position, or it should not be the position of BBC employees to be passing comment upon government policy, nor indeed the policy of the opposition. They should be scrupulously disinterested, and if they wish to take advantage of their fame and of their platforms to make political comments of this sort, they should resile from their positions with the BBC. They should resile from their positions which we are forced to pay for. I just don't think it is congruent. I'm a huge believer in free speech. I was one of the first people to join the Free Speech Union. But I think this is an issue where the contractual obligation overrides the right to free expression.
But I worry that, I take your point and I agree to you to some extent. Essentially, this could be just a conversation, a debate about a man going against his contract, breaking his contract, and then facing the repercussions like any of us would if we went against our contracts with our various employers. But Nigel, what I find interesting is that in this world of social media, everyone has their own personal brand alongside where they work. Is it frankly near impossible now for the BBC to police impartiality?
No, I don't think so. I mean, when it comes to social media, you take responsibility for your own social media. And as I've said, I think Gary Lineker went too far, and he should reflect on the fact about whether he's, as the face of BBC Sport, he should be putting out tweets like that. That is, in a sense, a different argument, because quite clearly the BBC says, well, actually, he is entitled to an opinion. And so on that basis, then, he's exercised that right seemingly under his contract. I don't think he should have done. I think it's very unwise for somebody in his position to be commenting on politics at all. But the BBC seem to say he can. Now, when it comes down to BBC impartiality, they've wrecked their own impartiality by siding with the government over this particular issue.
Yes, well, David, what do they do now in terms of managing their BBC staff and the many thousands, I think, of employees the BBC has? Because if they have now sacked Gary Lineker, that sets a precedent, a bigger precedent, or suspended him, a bigger precedent than previously when they just gave him a tap on the wrist.
I think there has been a suggestion in the past, when Richard Price came in, for instance, that BBC staff should not be using Twitter. That seems to me like a very simple thing to enact.
Really? That sounds horribly draconian. People view social media in such a... Well, it's their own personal brand. It's part of their identity now. It's how they promote themselves, their views, etc., etc. That would be horribly authoritarian, no?
Well, I don't think it's authoritarian. I think it's the case that many BBC staff seem incapable of restricting their own actions on Twitter. Emily Maitlis came under fire for this. When she was a BBC employee, she was censured several times for this. So there is a dichotomy here. Do we trust the staff to censor their own behaviour, to, as we all have to do to some degree or another, to think about what we're saying in the way that accords with our job and accords with our right to personal expression? Or does the organisation take what would be a draconian step, and yet perhaps a rational step in light of this latest incident, and say that if you wish to work for us, bearing in mind, again, as I'm going to return to throughout this debate, the fact that this is funded by a poll tax, you cannot use this. This is a condition of the pay and employ that you have here. You may not use it.
I mean, Nigel, I think that would be, well, I think the BBC would cease to exist. They certainly wouldn't be able to recruit any young people who have been using social media since they were little tiny children to be banned from social media entirely.
No, exactly. And David, as he says, is an advocate of freedom of speech. And surely the one thing you can do is to be free to have your own Twitter account. What I think you should then do is you should use it responsibly.
But they can't seem to do this now.
About freedom of speech is being responsible for what you say. So when you're on Twitter or any other social media, you're effectively broadcasting. And you must be conscious of your employer, which in this case is the BBC for Gary Lineker, about exactly what it is you're putting out there, but not to go around banning people from going on social media.
I quite agree, but and I'm not advocating for this, by the way. I'm just saying I could understand the logic or the step, not entirely logical, that the BBC were to take were it to do this, because it seems that BBC staff, particularly the higher paid ones with larger profiles in the public eye, are not always capable of restricting themselves to the comments that are congruent with their positions and their absolute duty to be disinterested. I'm not for a moment, and I don't want to be misquoted on this or to see this on the front page of the Sunday Mirror tomorrow, thanks, saying that BBC staff should not be using Twitter or should be banned from it or banned from Instagram. That would be ludicrous. I'm saying, however, I could understand why there might be a view within the BBC that this is the only way to control the beast.
Well, there you go. You're not going to put that out. You're not going to advocate for that entirely. But do you know what? I think the BBC is in such a mess at the moment. You have people on the left accusing it of being in cahoots with the Tory government and perpetuating right-wing policies, and then you've got people on the right saying it's a lefty, liberal, metropolitan, whole. So there you go. No, the BBC can't seem to please anyone. But thank you very much indeed for joining us, Nigel Nelson, of course, and David Oldroyd-Bolt. They will be staying with us for the next piece too. But first, I will go to a statement from the BBC. The BBC will air limited sport programming over the weekend and is working hard to resolve the situation, a spokesman for the broadcaster said, after presenters and pundits pulled out of several shows in support of Gary Lineker. In an earlier statement, the BBC said the BBC has been in extensive discussions with Gary and his team in recent days. We have said that we consider his recent social media activity to be a breach of our guidelines. The BBC has decided that he will step back from presenting Match of the Day until we've got an agreed and clear position on his use of social media. When it comes to leading our football and sports coverage, Gary is second to none. We have never said that Gary should be an opinion-free zone or that he can't have a view on issues that matter to him, but we have said that he should keep well away from taking sides on party political issues or political controversies. I think that's quite a difficult square to circle. Anyway, now in a statement from GB News, fans of Match of the Day, do not despair. The People's Channel has come to the rescue. Tune in to GB News tonight from 10 p.m. to watch our star-studded Match of the Day alternative with Mark Dolan. That will be on tonight at 10 p.m. Please do stay tuned for that. I think it will be a barrel of laughs. Now, moving on, we've got our political panel back, but on something very different. This week, the head of the UK's education watchdog, Ofsted, has criticised school sex education lessons, saying that content used in some classes had no basis in science. Amanda Spielman, the regulator's chief inspector, intervened after the Prime Minister announced a review of sex education in schools, as some reports suggest that children had been given graphic lessons on oral sex and choking. Earlier, Labour said if they win the next general election, they would create an annual review of safeguarding in schools, as they warn that too many girls are being exposed to intolerable language, images and behaviour. So Nigel and David are still with me. Nigel, what do you make of all this? Do you think It's got a bit tricky because there are so many reports of schools delivering the most awful sex education in schools. You know, you've got drag acts coming in saying there are 73 genders. As you said here, teaching about oral sex and masturbation and choking and all sorts. Do you think sex education needs to be reined in? Back to the birds and the bees.
Well, first of all, the various incidents you've mentioned, there's very little evidence that any of that is actually happening. That when it comes to the 73 genders, that was one school on the Isle of Man, which has its own government anyway. The only evidence for kids being taught about safe ways to choke somebody comes from someone's blog, so it's not something that appears to be in schools anyway. There is a review already going on. There's a statutory three-year review into sex and relationship education in schools, and that's already started. So what Rishi Sunak announced was in fact already happening. Where Amanda Spielman is absolutely right is it needs to look at the fact there are minimum expectations but no maximum. So the question is whether or not this now needs a bit more regulation than it's got at the moment.
Now, Nigel, you've played down those two incidents that were mentioned in my introduction there. But, David, I think what gets parents is how transgender ideology in particular is taught as fact.
Yes, and so it should do. And I take with an enormous bucket of salt the idea that Labour would do anything about this, because Labour is unable to define what a woman is. So the idea that children will be safeguarded by the Labour Party seems for the birds. The straightforward fact is that for a quarter of a century, the idea of sex education in schools has gone too far too far. It has taken the responsibility from parents and abrogated it to the state, which is always, in my view, wrong. And it has taken the age at which this begins to a frankly obscene level. There is no way that primary school children, particularly those of 4, 5 and 6 years old, should be learning about this sort of thing.
I mean, Nigel, are you concerned that children, because I'm concerned, if I have children, I will worry, and I'll probably be down to the school to check what my kids are being taught. I don't want them to be taught, for example, that gender is only assigned at birth, that gender can be fluid and that your identity can change with the wind, essentially. And it does seem that, like with critical race theory, this sort of thing is now quite commonplace.
Well, I mean, I think that the parents absolutely have a right to know what their children are being taught. I don't think they have the right to veto it as such, any more than they have a right to veto over any other part of the curriculum. But certainly parents should be kept in touch with what their children are learning.
So, Nigel, you don't, sorry to interrupt, you don't think that parents should be able to veto? Do you think they should be able to pull their children out of sex education?
No. I think that it's part of the national curriculum, and on that basis, then parents should allow that to go ahead. But they can certainly make objections. They should certainly know what is being taught. The whole point about sex and relationship education is that since it's been introduced, teen pregnancy rates have fallen. There's less sexually transmitted sexual diseases amongst youngsters. So their overall health improves, and they appear to delay having sex for longer. So there are benefits. The question really is whether it does need a bit more regulation.
Nigel, that might be...
know what it is.
Sorry to interrupt you again, but that might be a correlation, not a causation. A lot of other things have changed other than sex education and how it's taught. You know, girls have more opportunities. They're more ambitious in terms of going to university. They want to put off having children for many, many different reasons. And yes, there have been campaigns of awareness on STIs and that sort of thing. But I don't think it's just because sex education has become more broad in schools. David, what do you think?
No, and indeed the fact that they're having sexual education younger means that they're probably more aware of how contraception works, so you can't say that they're having less sex, it's just they're probably having safer sex. I simply don't think that this is the purview of the state. I think this is something that is down to parents and their relationship with their children, how they approach it, at what age they approach it, what manner of terminology they use, and the degree to which they're comfortable doing this. This is not a matter for the state to dictate to parents. This is the age at which your children should be aware of these things, particularly when we're talking about niche sexual practices.
Also, Nigel, do you think there is a danger? Because it's not always people who are particularly well, who aren't professionals in these areas who are chosen to teach these subjects. So it could be the geography teacher or the history teacher or the sociology teacher who comes in to teach a class about sex education. Do you think there's a risk? Now, I don't mean to be a conspiracy theorist, but do you think that there might be a risk that some teachers might use sex education as a way to indoctrinate or to, in their words, educate children on things like transgender ideology and things that aren't based necessarily in scientific fact?
Well, I mean, that's the point that Amanda Spielman was making, that all teaching should be based on scientific fact. And that is the point about the review, to look at whether it should be regulated better. And obviously, Ofsted and Amanda Spielman are the right people then to do that. I think what you've got to do then is make sure that teachers have the leeway to be able to answer children's questions honestly, but have some guidance about how to frame those answers.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Any final remarks, David?
Well, this is not just a matter of fact, of scientific fact. This is a matter of morality, of practice, of culture, and of approach, each of which is individual to a family. And I just don't think that we can say that it's fine to teach these things to children because they are matters of scientific fact. This is for families to decide among themselves. It is not for the state to do. It is about time that the Conservative Party actually lived up to its name and propounded a conservative theory.
And then there's, of course, the whole minefield around religious schools teaching God knows what. But thank you very much indeed.
Well, he should do.
Thank you very much indeed, both of you, for joining us. Nigel Nelson and David Oldroyd-Bolt, thank you very much indeed. We've got a statement from a Department of Education spokesman who said, "We will write to all schools this term to emphasise the rights of parents to see teaching materials being taught to their children. Schools must make sure all content they use is factual and age-appropriate and engage with parents so they are aware of what their children are being taught." Sounds fair enough. This is Real Britain on GB News, TV, online and digital radio. Plenty more coming up on today's show, but first, here's your latest weather.
Hello there, I'm Greg Dewhurst and welcome to your latest broadcast from the Met Office. We'll see rain and hail snow pushing northeastwards through the next 24 hours or so, turning breezy, but mild air is returning from the Atlantic. And we can see that in the bigger picture. We can see the oranges and yellows starting to creep in from the southwest, the blues being shunted away as we head through later Sunday into the beginning of next week. But does it last? Well, we'll see in the outlook. Through the rest of Saturday evening, we can see that band of rain across parts of Northern Ireland into northern England, pushing its way north and east, with some hail snow possible across the Pennines up into the mountains of Scotland. Met Office warnings in force for snow and ice, perhaps up to 10 centimetres over the Scottish mountains. Some icy stretches here, but that mild air starting to move in from the southwest of 5 to 7 by Sunday morning. But it is a dry picture to start Sunday across much of England and Wales. We see some sunny spells. Early rain will clear the northeast of Scotland to allow brighter skies for a time, before then thicker cloud and outbreaks of rain move in here for the afternoon, also across Northern Ireland, where the rain could be heavy at times, and then later on in the day some further rain coming into parts of Cornwall. A mild day for everyone, 12, 13, 14 degrees by Sunday afternoon in the best of any sunnier breaks. It does turn wetter and windier through the evening, though, on Sunday as bands of weather systems move in, this rain turning heavy at times, particularly across southern parts of Scotland into Northern Ireland. Too, the wind starting to pick up. Irish Sea coasts could start to see gales by Monday morning, but a very mild night, temperatures 9, 10, 11 Celsius, so any lying snow over the hills will melt quite quickly. Then into Monday, we'll generally see an unsettled day for many. There'll be outbreaks of rain pushing eastwards across England and Wales, some very strong winds, gales around the coast. Rain across Northern Ireland, southern Scotland, falling as snow over the high ground here. So some cold air nearby, outbreaks of rain, but for most it will be mild on Monday. Before then, that cold air returns to everyone by Tuesday.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. I campaigned in the largest democratic vote in our island's story. I know this country has so much to be proud of. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better. The wisdom of the nation is in its people. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. That's why I'm joining the People's Channel. Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the people's channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The people's channel.
Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates. Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton Tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel. Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News. The People's Channel. Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, welcome to Real Britain with me, Emily Carver, on TV, online and digital radio. We've got plenty more coming up on the show. We'll actually be speaking to Patrick Christys in just one moment about something special we've got coming up tonight. We'll also speak more about the Gary Lineker suspension with a few different guests and the latest line in the lockdown files too. But first, let's get the news with Ray Addison.
Thanks, Emily. Good afternoon. It's 3 o'clock. Here's the latest. The BBC has apologised and says it's working hard to resolve the situation after experiencing a mass boycott by its sports presenters. It comes after Gary Lineker was forced to step back from Match of the Day over a tweet criticising the government's migration policy. The show will go ahead tonight, but Alan Shearer and Ian Wright have backed out. Meanwhile, Football Focus and Final Score have been cancelled after Alex Scott and Jason Mohammed said they won't appear. Lib Dem leader Sir Ed Davey is now calling on BBC chairman Richard Sharp to resign, whilst Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer says the corporation is in the wrong.
The BBC is not acting impartially by caving in to Tory MPs who are complaining about Gary Lineker. They've got this one badly wrong, and now they're very, very exposed, as is the government, because at the heart of this is the government's failure on the asylum system. And rather than take responsibility for the mess they've made, the government is casting around to blame anybody else, Gary Lineker, the BBC, civil servants, the Blob. What they should be doing is standing up, accepting they've broken the asylum system and telling us what they're going to do to actually fix it, not whinging on about Gary Lineker.
The Chancellor has told GB News that he wants Britain to have the most competitive business tax rates amid calls to scrap a planned hike in corporation tax. Ahead of Wednesday's spring budget, Jeremy Hunt spoke to Esther McVeigh and Phil Davis on his plans to deliver growth and tackle inflation. He said the corporation tax increase from 19 to 25% would still leave the UK with a lower rate than nearly all major rivals. But he said he was committed to previous promises of bringing down the corporation tax.
What we now have is a responsible outlook for public finances. The markets have recognised that by bringing down mortgage rates, interest rates, and we're on track to bring inflation down. But if you're saying to me, as a Conservative Chancellor, do I want to bring down taxes? Well, I want to bring down personal taxes because that is at the heart of what being a Conservative is. But I want to bring down business taxes even more.
Junior doctors say they have no choice but to strike on Monday after the Health Secretary failed to attend talks on Friday. It comes after Steve Barclay said he wanted them to call off a planned 3-day walkout and negotiate. Nearly 40,000 junior doctors belonging to the British Medical Association voted to take industrial action. They're demanding a 35% pay rise and warn that future strikes could last longer than 72 hours. Staying with health, and NHS England says more than 100,000 patients have been treated in virtual wards over the last year. The patients stay in their own homes whilst receiving treatment and have their vital signs monitored remotely. Medical bosses say the scheme has been a real game changer, helping patients to avoid unnecessary hospital trips. A man has been arrested under the Terrorism Act after the new IRA claimed responsibility for the shooting of Detective Chief Inspector John Caldwell. It follows the search of a property in the Londonderry area. Police say the 25-year-old will also be questioned over a hoax security alert. Earlier, a typed message was posted on a wall in Derry claiming responsibility for Mr. Caldwell's attempted murder. He remains critically ill in hospital after being shot several times in Omagh. Silicon Valley Bank UK says it will be put into insolvency from Sunday evening. It comes after its parent company in America was put under US government control, becoming the biggest failure of a US bank since the 2008 financial crisis. Both the Chancellor and the Governor of the Bank of England have spoken together about the collapse. The government says it's been speaking to affected customers and will be holding discussions with industry leaders later today. And Tom Hanks has been named the worst supporting actor at the 2023 Razzie Awards. And a warning for those watching on television, the following footage contains flashing images. The Oscar-winning actor was chosen for his depiction of Colonel Tom Parker in the movie Elvis. His portrayal of Presley's former manager was described by judges as cruel. They also slammed his character's latex face. The awards honour poor performances in Hollywood movies and are held a day before the Oscars. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens, and let's get back to Real Britain with Emily.
Yes, welcome back to Real Britain with me, Emily Carver. So here's what we've got coming up on the show, if you hadn't noticed. The BBC sports schedule has suffered major disruption as many sporting pundits stand in solidarity with Gary Lineker. We'll have the very latest on that situation. Plus, we'll be telling you more about GB News' alternative match of the day with none other than GB News' Patrick Christys. We'll be discussing politics across the pond too, as rumours suggest that Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is about to confirm he'll run for president next year. We ask, who would be the best for the UK? Trump, DeSantis or Biden? And the majority of Generation Z and Millennials have said that women's rights have gone too far. We'll be debating that issue. Of course, I would love to know your thoughts on today's topics. Please do tweet me at GB News, or you can email me on gbviews@gbnews.uk. Was the BBC right to suspend Gary Lineker? That's what I want to know. You can watch us online on YouTube. Back in a sec. Right, so unless you've been hiding under a rock or living in space, you'll know that the country's national broadcaster is under rather a lot of pressure today. Yesterday, it emerged that Gary Lineker had been suspended from Match of the Day until he agrees a social media policy with the BBC. The newest news line in this story is that the BBC has apologised to staff after it dropped much of its sports programming this weekend, according to a leaked letter shared on Twitter by The Times' chief football writer, Henry Winter. So let's cross live to the home of the BBC, Broadcasting House in central London, where we are joined by GB News reporter Jack Carson. Jack, have there been any more people threatening to quit? Does the BBC have any sports presenters left?
Well, so far, no more people threatening to quit, but you're right. We have had this leaked letter or email that's been sent by the director of BBC Sport, Barbara Slater, to staff, and I'll just read a little bit of it now. It says, "We're sorry about the impact that the news relating to Gary Lineker and Match of the Day is having across the department this weekend. We understand how unsettling this is for all of you, the staff in the BBC Sport and our freelance community, and we understand the strength of feeling which has been generated by this issue." So it shows the issue, the feeling amongst BBC Sport staff, of course, when they decided to join a lot of the other pundits like Ian Wright, Alex Scott, within this boycott of not choosing to help produce the programmes, present the programmes. We've also heard from the BBC themselves, who have apologised essentially for what it's called a limited sport programming this weekend. They say, "We're sorry for these changes, which we recognise will be disappointed for BBC Sport fans," going on to say, "We're working hard to resolve the situation, and we hope to do so." We have heard from Keir Starmer, leader of the opposition, this afternoon, who's been speaking at the Welsh Labour conference. He said that the BBC have got this one badly wrong, and now they're very, very exposed. The Department for Media, Culture and Sport have said that this is an individual case, which is a matter for the BBC. But amongst backbenchers, the Common Sense group of MPs, led by Sir John Hayes, has called on Gary Lineker to apologise, and that's where the row has now kind of exploded into what it has become, because after meeting with BBC hierarchy and some of the BBC bosses yesterday, Gary Lineker messaged those friends saying he'd been asked to step back, which is where we've now seen these boycotts come in.
And I'm just reading as well that there are reports that Match of the Day could still be scrapped tonight because apparently there might be 50 minutes of silence because the broadcaster doesn't have rights to commentaries supplied by Premier League Productions. Now, that would be quite something. 50 minutes of silence.
Well, that's right, because when the commentators yesterday in their statement said that they were going to step back and not commentate this weekend, they kind of alluded to the fact that management could use kind of world service commentary if they chose to do so, and use the world feed of commentary for the matches. But of course, there's a whole issue here with broadcast rights and whether they'll be able to use that. And also, as well, we've heard today from the Professional Footballers Association, who represents almost as a union football players and managers, and they've said that the Premier League's informed all of the clubs that they don't have to do their match duties, their post-match duties with interviews with Match of the Day, which means that when it comes to the programme tonight and what that programme might look like, you're right, it might just be silent highlights of the game with nothing in between. So we're not really sure how that programme's going to shape up and whether the BBC might not have any other choice but to scrap that as well.
I don't know what viewers at home think, but I'm finding this rather a little bit amusing, I must say. Thank you very much, Jack Carson there, outside the BBC. Jack Carson, our news reporter. So, it's not just been sporting stars and fans that have expressed their views on the situation. The BBC is under pressure from all sides of the political spectrum to come up with a solution to end this crisis that Jack just highlighted there. So, joining me now to discuss the political reaction is Benjamin Loughnane, a research fellow from the Bow Group. Ben, our question of the day: was the BBC right to suspend Gary Lineker over this tweet?
I'm a bit split on this, actually, because on the one hand, there is a free speech issue here. He should be allowed to have an opinion and say what he thinks. But on the other hand, he's taking vast sums of public money, and his job is to provide commentary on sport, not to provide a running commentary on the government and whether he thinks they're a bunch of Nazis. So I do think, it's a split issue. Fundamentally, it might backfire on the BBC because they've gone against Gary Lineker and told him that, he can't be doing this. Sorry, I get them mixed up.
You can't get your Garys mixed up.
Can't get my Garys mixed up. but then there's the double standard. We saw Andrew Bridgen said something very similar recently. He ended up having the Conservative Party whip removed. He got basically blackballed by most of the media. He effectively got cancelled for saying something which wasn't too dissimilar to what Gary Lineker said. So I do think there's a case of free speech for me, but not for the left can get away with saying whatever they want. But the moment anyone else says something, it's cancelled immediately.
Yes. Do you think there's something a bit squiffy, though, about how many Conservative MPs came out publicly to, demand or encourage the BBC to take a tough stance with Gary?
Yeah, I don't think it's the best look. I think it backfires in terms of public opinion. I think people will see it as the government doubling down or piling on to Gary Lineker over what he said. So I think in terms of the public, a lot of people will support Gary Lineker for this. But that being said, he is being paid huge amounts of money to provide football commentary, not to be a politician. And I think he really needs to, draw the line.
Yeah, and also I want to ask our viewers, as well as you, of course, I think it's a bit mean of Gary Lineker, actually, not to encourage someone else, perhaps more junior or who hasn't got the same airtime as him, to maybe stand in for this one, get some experience. It's an amazing opportunity. Instead, he seems to be welcoming everyone boycotting.
Yeah, absolutely. It started out as a boycott, a matter of principle, people stepping aside saying we're not going to do this. But now it's got to the point where if you do take that job, if you do go and present it, you're effectively going to get cancelled yourself. You're not going to have any friends left because everyone will see you as almost like a scab who crosses the picket line. So they've all gone out on strike, and anyone who takes that job is then going to be sort of the enemy.
Well, that's true. You'd be hounded out, removed from the industry, ridiculed if you were to dare to say, put yourself forward, put your hand up for the position. Although I imagine there are very many pundits who would absolutely love to do what Gary Lineker gets paid so much for. Something that might be quite amusing is the match of the day figures. Now, obviously, if it is a 50 minutes of silence, I don't think the viewing figures will do very well. But if they do get to have some kind of commentary this evening, could it be that the viewing figures don't drop that much? And people start to question why Gary Lineker is paid so much at the BBC.
Yeah, I think actually, given the amount of press that there's been around this, a lot of people will tune in just to see what's going on, just to see what they do about it. So the viewing figures may even go up. But at the end of the day, Match of the Day is about watching the football. It's about seeing what happened in the day's football. It's not about the commentary. It's not about Gary Lineker. It's actually just about the games. And I don't think he's that necessary. I think he's, giving himself a little bit too much importance.
Well, there you go. Some people think he's a fantastic broadcaster. Other people think he's, not that special. Thank you very much indeed, Benjamin Loughnane from the Bow Group, joining us there to go through the latest on the Gary Lineker saga. So the BBC will air limited, this is a statement, the BBC will air limited sport programming over the weekend and is working hard to resolve the situation. That's after presenters and pundits pulled out of several shows in support of Gary Lineker. In an earlier statement, the BBC said, the BBC has been in extensive discussions with Gary and his team in recent days. We have said that we consider his recent social media activity to be a breach of our guidelines. The BBC has decided that he will step back from presenting Match of the Day until we've got an agreed and clear position on his use of social media. When it comes to leading our football and sports coverage, Gary is second to none. We have never said that Gary should be an opinion-free zone or that he can't have a view on issues that matter to him. But we have said that he should keep well away from taking sides on party political issues or political controversies. Now, in a statement from GB News, Match of the Day fans, do not worry, the People's Channel has the perfect solution for you. Well, hey, there we go. Tune into GB News tonight from 10 p.m. to watch our star-studded Match of the Day alternative with Mark Dolan. Now, moving on. Do stay tuned for that. I think it'll be a right laugh. Anyway, this week, royal news. The royal family's official website was updated to reflect the Duke and Duchess of Sussex's children's new titles, Prince Archie and Princess Lilibet. Harry and Meghan's youngsters become a prince and princess on the accession of their grandfather, the King, 6 months ago. But the Sussexes publicly used Lily's title for the first time on Wednesday when announcing their daughter's christening. Also yesterday, Prince Edward was named as the new Duke of Edinburgh. So to discuss these stories, we're joined by royal broadcaster and commentator Rafe Hadel-Manku. So where shall we start, Rafe?
Well, let's start with the most ridiculous story, of course, and that naturally involves Harry and Meghan, because this episode actually exposes how ridiculous and ignorant Meghan is and how her ignorance actually resulted in that race storm that really engulfed the world and damaged the monarchy. Because you may remember that infamous interview she gave with Oprah Winfrey in 2021. And at that time, she was incredulous that her son Archie was not automatically a prince like Prince William's children. And she alleged at that time, she gave the impression that this was due to her son being mixed race, which was an outrageous calumny, against the royal family. Because as we now know, far from being a racist snub, the palace was simply following strict protocol. And, anybody with a smartphone and 10 minutes, you can go on Google and they could have found that out for themselves very easily. So why Meghan had to belabor this point of race is beyond me, because it's well established since 1917, King George V laid down that all of the male line grandchildren of the monarch become prince and princesses. But in terms of great-grandchildren, and in 2021, Archie was a great-grandchild, only the eldest son of the Prince of Wales's children become prince and princesses. So it was only with the Queen's death and King Charles' accession that Archie and Lilibet became eligible for these titles. And this is simply that protocol playing out. So whether it's deliberately or through complete stupidity, Meghan painted an entirely fictional picture around race. And I think that's quite despicable. And yet we've had no apology from the Sussexes again for allowing the royal family's reputation to be besmirched.
I don't think there will ever be an apology, Rafe, from what we've seen anyway. Now, some people have said this is fantastic. This is a sign of reconciliation. It's a sign of Meghan and Harry wanting some kind of reconciliation, essentially. I'm a little bit more cynical, a little bit more suspicious that essentially they just want the titles because it's beneficial to them, and they have essentially been not so nice to the royal family for a long time, and this is a bit of a cheek.
How dare you, Emily, honestly, how can you be so cynical? Yeah, absolutely. Look, for a couple who are seemingly so opposed to hierarchy and this class-ridden, protocol accepts, stultifying elitist royal family, it's very funny how much they love these royal titles, and it's pure hypocrisy. Contrast this with Prince Edward. When his children were born, they were legally Prince and Princess of Wales automatically. However, he didn't give them those titles. They were raised with far more humble titles of Lord and Lady because they wanted to ensure that their children had a much more grounded and down-to-earth upbringing. So why would Harry and Meghan want their children in the USA, which doesn't recognize titles, is actually as opposed to titles, why would they want their children to be so grandly raised as a prince and princess? Could it be because they know the social and commercial cachet that has? I don't know. It seems to me that they're sort of trying to become like aristocratic versions of David and Victoria Beckham, just trying to market their family and their children and sell their brand, even if it means that their children are going to grow up like privileged brats, potentially.
So this isn't a sign that they may be planning a move back to Britain to take advantage of the titles?
I rather doubt it. They just had the christening. They just had the christening for Lilibet, and Omid Scobie, their lackey, said that an invitation was extended to the King and Prince William to attend, and they received the invitation but didn't attend. And I rather think we all hope that they do the same thing when it comes to the coronation.
Now, Rafe, lastly, you give your analysis and astute commentary on a variety of topics. Will you answer our question of the day on Real Britain, which is, was the BBC right to suspend Gary Lineker because of his tweets?
Yeah, I'll be a hypocrite if I didn't say that everyone has the right to free expression. But isn't it funny, that suddenly Britain's sports commentators are taking a moral stand on this issue? What happened to those morals, during the World Cup? They were very happy to pocket cash from the Qatari World Cup. I don't want to know, do they actually think that Gary Lineker, this millionaire's suspension from a TV show, is actually a greater outrage than the deaths and slave labor and the persecution of gays and women in Qatar? It's utter hypocrisy. Lineker said a few unpleasant words about Qatar, but the fact is, for 4 years, he took money from Al Jazeera, which is owned by Qatar. That's $1.6 million, I think he got from there. Not once did we hear him protesting about that. Look, and I'd say that they've got a lot more in common with 1930s Germany than our government is. He's an independent man. He's a contractor. He's allowed to have free speech. But his Twitter profile was created on the back of his BBC status. He wouldn't have anywhere near as strong a following on Twitter were it not for his BBC position. When he speaks, people think of the BBC. So yes, he has the right to say what he wants to do, but the BBC has a right to uphold its guidelines, which he was warned in the past he mustn't violate. This is another strike against him. So I think that they were right here, even though we must protect, of course, the right to free speech.
Well, I think that's a very measured response from you, as always. Rafe Haydel-Munku, here broadcaster and commentator, of course, normally on royal issues with me, actually, but there, giving his hot take on Gary Lineker. Thank you very much indeed. Plenty more to come this afternoon on Real Britain. After the break, we'll be talking politics from across the pond. But first, let's have a look at the weather.
Hello there, I'm Greg Dewhurst and welcome to your latest broadcast from the Met Office. We'll see rain and hail snow pushing northeastwards through the next 24 hours or so, turning breezy, but mild air is returning from the Atlantic. And we can see that in the bigger picture. We can see the oranges and yellows starting to creep in from the southwest, the blues being shunted away as we head through later Sunday into the beginning of next week. But does it last? Well, we'll see in the outlook. Through the rest of Saturday evening, we can see that band of rain across parts of Northern Ireland into northern England, pushing its way north and eastward. Some hail snow possible across the Pennines up into the mountains of Scotland. Met Office warnings in force for snow and ice, perhaps up to 10 centimetres over the Scottish mountains. Some icy stretches here, but that mild air starting to move in from the southwest of 5 to 7 by Sunday morning. But it is a dry picture to start Sunday across much of England and Wales. We see some sunny spells. Early rain will clear the northeast of Scotland to allow brighter skies for a time. Before then, thicker cloud and outbreaks of rain move in here for the afternoon, also across Northern Ireland, where the rain could be heavy at times. And then later on in the day, some further rain coming into parts of Cornwall. A mild day for everyone, 12, 13, 14 degrees by Sunday afternoon in the best of any sunnier breaks. It does turn wetter and windier through the evening, though, on Sunday as bands of weather systems move in, this rain turning heavy at times, particularly across southern parts of Scotland into Northern Ireland. Too, the wind starting to pick up. Irish Sea coasts could start to see gales by Monday morning, but a very mild night. Temperatures 9, 10, 11 Celsius, so any lying snow over the hills will melt quite quickly. Then into Monday, we'll generally see an unsettled day for many. There'll be outbreaks of rain pushing eastwards across England and Wales, some very strong winds, gales around the coast. Rain across Northern Ireland, southern Scotland, falling as snow over the high ground here. So some cold air nearby, outbreaks of rain, but for most it will be mild on Monday. Before then, that cold air returns to everyone by Tuesday.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different. Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512.
Virgin Media Channel 604.
Freesat Channel 216.
Freeview Channel 236.
And YouView Channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB Plus Radio.
With the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Nana Akue, Saturday and Sunday afternoons on GB News. Expect fiery debate and passionate discussion as me and my panel tackle some of the biggest topics hitting the headlines. It's a place for everyone's opinion. No one gets cancelled, but no one gets an easy ride.
Oh, she's on it today!
Be ready for conversations that are fierce, frank, and of course, fun. Every Saturday and Sunday afternoon from 4 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians
to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Welcome back. This is Real Britain with me, Emily Carver. So, I want to take you briefly across the Atlantic, where Republican politics is heating up. The election is still 605 days away, but in true American style, speculation over the runners and riders has already begun. Former President Donald Trump has already declared he will run for the Republican nomination. Also, the former US Ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, she's declared her intention to run, but there's one Republican the political world is watching, Florida Republican Ron DeSantis. Could he be the next President of the United States? Joining me now to discuss this is Sarah Elliott from Republicans Overseas UK. Thank you very much for joining us, Sarah Elliott, on Real Britain. So is Ron DeSantis very much the one to watch?
Absolutely. He is a governor who has won re-election in a purple state by 19 points. He's leading the fastest growing economically big state in the union. Many great statistics there for him as governor. He also kept the country open mostly during COVID and had no vaccine mandates or passports as law. So he is riding high. And when a governor is riding this high, especially after a re-election, it's very rare they don't want to throw their hat in the ring.
He seems a pretty exciting candidate. I mean, I've thought quite long and hard whether I'd quite like to move to Florida, actually. It seems like everything is going pretty great over there. Now, I read a Telegraph article by Kate Andrews, who you probably know. She wrote yesterday for the Telegraph talking about how people from blue states, i.e. Democrat states, are moving in their hordes over to red states like Florida, like Texas, because in terms of economics, they're booming.
Booming. They're actually the largest net migration receiver of new people to the state, and yet they're having the biggest budget surpluses. They have some of the lowest taxes from throughout the country, and they also have a 50-year low crime rate. It is a very attractive place to go, plus it's the Sunshine State, and you have great weather year-round. So it is the place to be, and you can find signs all throughout Florida that say, you can come here from the north, but don't change your voting habits. We want to keep the state as it is.
Well, this is the thing. People tweeted me when I suggested I might move to Florida. They tweeted me saying, oh, well, all the Democrat voters are coming over here, so it won't be like this for long. So I guess there's probably some truth to that. But any discussion about American politics, we couldn't have one without mentioning Trump. How much support does he still have?
Oh, he has lots of support, especially amongst the grassroots. I mean, he is, for instance, in Iowa, where Ron DeSantis just went, which is the first primary caucus state in the union for a primary presidential election. And Trump still leads DeSantis by, 7 points among Iowan Republicans. Trump is also from Florida, so it could very well be a very bloody primary fight in the state of Florida amongst donors and voters who probably love the governor, want him to stay governor, but would like to see Trump as president. However, Ron DeSantis is words that describe him from voters are statesman, a new generation, young leadership, bold. He's a freedom fighter. And they like all of that. He's also very good in a press conference and will fight with the left-wing journalists, which the base also likes. So it's actually tearing at the base a bit, these two men who come from the same state. But, there are going to be a lot of other presidential candidates in the race as well. We have Nikki Haley, who used to work for Trump as UN ambassador. She was also governor of South Carolina, one of the first primary states in the presidential election. And then we also have rumored Mike Pompeo, who was Secretary of State under Trump, and the Vice President, Mike Pence, who was Trump's number 2. And Glenn Youngkin, the governor of Virginia, who was the miraculous victory that finally turned Virginia red after many elections and decades of it being a blue governor. And he did so without mentioning the name Trump. So, that actually helps Donald Trump when you have many candidates in the race. But I think his number one foe is Ron DeSantis, who is right in his backyard.
It does appear like that. Thank you very much. Sorry to cut that short, but thank you very much for joining us to discuss that. Sarah Elliott from Republicans Overseas UK. Right, well, we're going to come back to the UK, to our top story, the ongoing saga over Gary Lineker's suspension. Here at GB News, we're giving you a real treat. At 10 p.m. tonight, our very own Mark Dolan will be hosting an alternative match of the day. So what can we expect? Well, Patrick is in the studio with me now to discuss. So what's coming up?
Well, loads of football. That's right. I couldn't miss an opportunity to stick it to Lineker and co. So between 10 and 11 o'clock, we decided we're going to present our very own alternative match of the day. Should just clarify, really, though, Emily, that does mean I will not be home, so I'll cancel all the plans that we had. And because I am now getting an insight into what Alan Shearer and Gary Lineker's life really is, instead of doing all the chores that I had planned, like the dishes, the washing...
You're hiring a cleaner?
No, I've just come here and watched football and I'm going to talk about it this evening with my mates.
Right, well, we'll talk about that later.
Basically, we've got 6 big matches.
What can we expect? What can we expect?
Absolutely loads. So we've got 6 big matches. We are going to do it properly. Now, we obviously can't show, which some would argue is a devastating blow to our ability to broadcast not match of the day, but not this guy. We aren't allowed to show any of the footage because the BBC have stolen it all. OK, they've stolen it like they stole the nation's hearts, and so. What we're going to do is we've got loads of picture, we're going to be doing loads of analysis, we've got a top panel coming your way as well, and we are basically going to do an absolute number on it. At the end of the day, Match of the Day caters for around 7 million people. I am fascinated, by the way, to see how those figures do indeed drop, but we need to kind of hoover up some of those people, give them some top-quality punditry, and report not just from what goes on in the left wing.
Well, we've got a sting coming up. Our advert is coming up right now.
Is it?
You're going to have to stay tuned for Match of the Day.
There's no expense spared there, is there?
No expense spared. I think it looks pretty nice. I'm looking forward to seeing who's on the panel. You've got to tune into GB News tonight from 10 p.m. to watch it, our star-studded Match of the Day alternative with Mark Dolan and Patrick Christys, your GB News on TV, DAB radio. After the break, we'll debate whether women's rights have gone too far. After a poll suggested the majority of young people tend to think so. But first, let's get a check on the news headlines with Tatiana Sanchez.
Emily, thank you and good afternoon. This is the latest from the GB newsroom. The BBC has apologised and says it's working hard to resolve the situation after experiencing a mass boycott by its sports presenters. It comes after the broadcaster forced Gary Lineker to step back from Match of the Day over a tweet that was critical of the government. The show will go ahead this evening, but Alan Shearer and Ian Wright have both backed out. Meanwhile, Football Focus and Final Score were cancelled after Alex Scott and Jason Mohammed said they won't appear on the shows. The Chancellor has told GB News he wants Britain to have the most competitive business tax rates amid calls to scrap a planned hike in corporation tax. Ahead of Wednesday's budget, Jeremy Hunt spoke exclusively about his plans to deliver growth and tackle inflation. He said the increase from 19% to 25% would still leave the UK with a lower corporation tax rate than nearly all major rivals. And a 25-year-old man has been arrested under the Terrorism Act after the new IRA claimed responsibility for the shooting of Detective Chief Inspector John Caldwell. It follows the search of a property in the Londonderry area. Police say the man will also be questioned over a hoax security alert. Mr. Caldwell remains critically ill in hospital after being shot several times in Omagh. TV, online and DAB+ radio. This is GB News.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "Nana, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the people's channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different. Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. This is Real Britain with me, Emily Carver. Now, a surprising number of people in younger generations believe that women's rights have gone too far. New research conducted by Ipsos and the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College London found that over half of people in younger generations, that's Gen Z and millennials, believe the push for equality is now negatively impacting men and that they are being expected to do too much to support progress. Very interesting indeed. Joining me to discuss this is Joseph Robertson, Director at Orthodox Conservatives, as well as the author and broadcaster Amy Nickel. Now, Amy, have women's rights gone too far?
OK, so where to start, frankly? It's nice to see that the man hasn't bothered to come in the studio. I think that says quite a bit. Now, when you said a lot of men feel that women's rights have a negative effect on them, I think that's what we need to push away for. Men and women are allies in this struggle. Now, 2 examples stood out to me this week, which I think clearly demonstrate that while we do have equality, we don't always have it in practice. All we need to do is look at the fact that when we talk about gender-based violence against women, Jess Phillips did her speech this week. She read out the number of women killed by men. This speech lasted 5 minutes. And then just a few days before that, Kemi Badenoch stood up at the Committee about Menopause Support and said, oh, that's a left-wing concern, and just bashed down any possibility to reform the support that women get during menopause. That added to the old evergreen inequality topics, gender pay gap, disproportionate domestic burden, the childcare burden, things like the pink tax, the fact that I have to pay more for a razor than Joseph because mine's pink. I have to pay more for a plain T-shirt because I'm a woman. You're a mug for buying the pink one, Amy. You know, all these things. And what we've seen is if we stop pushing forward for women's rights, they can be taken away from us. And I think we've seen that in America with what's happened with Roe versus Wade. Women's rights aren't concrete. None of our rights are concrete. They can be retracted.
Well, that's very true. Joseph, you're a brave man coming on with two women to debate women's rights, but I'll let you have your view, certainly. Why do you think Gen Z and millennials think women's rights have gone too far?
Because they're finally realising that no one ever has tried to define what rights really are and where it all ends. And the problem is when you go along with such a loose term as rights without seeking to define what they actually are or what they're trying to achieve, you inevitably get bad actors who come in and take a good cause and malappropriate it for their own purposes. And this is what we found with women's rights. Sure, everybody in the world wants to see fair outcomes for women, and want to see equality of opportunity. But the issue is that that's not what it's all about now. It's all about equality of outcome in every metric, regardless of whether or not it actually helps women. And it's not really about women, it's about trying to get an easy ride for a lot of people. And I think that's the reality. Amy, brought up something that I think is a bit of a straw man, really, if we're going to debate women's rights. I don't think someone reading out the number of murders committed by predominantly men, which is the case in most crimes because men are generally committing the most crimes, is anything to do with women's rights.
We're talking about women that were killed because they're women.
I don't think they were killed because they were women. I think they were killed because they were vulnerable. And that's the job of the police to stop that. Wherever you have someone who's vulnerable, which is probably statistically more likely to be a woman, they need to be defended and protected. I don't think that's anything to do with women's rights.
That's a nonsense. If Sarah Everard was a man, she would be alive today.
What, so you're saying that because of her gender, she's more likely to die?
Well,
she was killed for being a woman.
Let me give
and how does that have anything to do with rights?
Because a man is rarely murdered on the basis of his gender.
So it's his right not to be murdered, is that what you're saying?
I think as women, we clearly have a right to safety. Feminism is about choices. I should have
everyone has a right
to be able to go out wearing whatever I want and not be at risk of getting murdered.
Right, well, let's come back to, because Joseph did make an important point there about the difference between equality of opportunity, which most people would support, and then equality of outcome. Because, Amy, I'm in very much, I could see both sides on this one, because sometimes women's rights means box ticking, it means quotas for jobs, it means all-female shortlists, sometimes it means demonising men when they don't necessarily deserve it. Can you see how some people might think that the whole women's rights movement has gone too far in asking for those things that amount to equality of outcome rather than opportunity?
I don't, because I think that when you position it like that, men's rights are at odds with women's rights and vice versa, they're actually not. And dismantling patriarchy would benefit both men and women because it negatively impacts us both. There are negative impacts of it to men and women. I acknowledge that there are areas in which men have shortcomings, such as the criminal justice system, the family courts. But feminism wants to equalise that as well.
I think it depends on which feminist you talk to. But I'll come back to you, Joseph, but Amy, what does dismantling the patriarchy mean?
Taking apart a system that was founded to benefit men over women and giving men the underpinning control, and also reinforcing gender norms. They don't help anyone. So what's the most common people at risk of suicide is men in their 40s. Could that be something to do with the gender norm that is expected of them?
Well, Joseph,
there's a lot of pressure on men.
Joseph, why is that? I think young men in particular, with the rise of Andrew Tate and whatnot, are looking for male role models and perhaps finding them in bad places because they're not sure who they're supposed to be now. Are they supposed to be a provider? Are they supposed to be, more emotionally intelligent or whatever it is?
Well, I think men should just be allowed to be men, to be perfectly honest. Suicide rates have only rocketed in the male population since the sexual revolution of the 1960s and the absolute obliteration of male and female role models. I think what you're looking at now is what happens when people are taken outside of a practical social arrangement, which is that men should be allowed to fulfill their natural biological function and women should be allowed to fulfill their natural biological function. And if you want to talk about equality of possibility in this country, I mean, we've just had our longest reigning monarch who happens to be a woman. So if you really want to talk about patriarchy, I think you better choose a different country to try and do that in, because the top of the creme de la creme of our elite are very often female in this country. So I think if you really want to talk about, structures, maybe look to a different country to use an analogy there. I think if you're going to talk about, careers, let's look at bricklaying as a good example. I want to see quotas in bricklaying. I don't understand why more women aren't bricklayers in this country, and I've been saying this for a long time now. I think that there should be, less female quotas, for instance, at the BAFTAs, and perhaps more in bricklaying communities, because that would be a brilliant equality of outcome for everyone involved.
Well, there you go, Amy.
I mean, I don't. So, for example,
you should want equality across the board, including construction.
I would say I want equality of choice. And interestingly, on the way here, I was actually reading about a lot of sexist tropes within plumbing, and women don't have the access to plumbing, and maybe some of these.
Also, some women might not want to be plumbers.
But that's correct, and we should have the right to choose between what we want to do. But it's not.
And we do.
Mistaken. But it's not. But it's still the case that there's a disproportionality between the jobs that we perhaps go towards because of gendered norms.
Do you think, Joseph?
But I think we want to get rid of gender norms. I thought gender norms were bad.
Idea.
Joseph, I like gender norms to an extent. I think it's nice that men often want to provide and they want to be gentlemanly,
but they
and they want
feel
to
that they
be
have
protectors often. And I think it's nice that women are sometimes more nurturing, perhaps, in some of their relationships.
But they shouldn't feel like they have to either. It's about choice.
There is that. Well, I've forgotten where I was going now, but. So we're going to wrap it up there because I was just on a roll of that.
It's all secular, isn't it? It's all secular because at one point we don't want gender norms because they might be bad, and as soon as someone points out the obvious, we do want gender norms because they work and they're good.
They don't
and I think
work,
the reality is, if you
good.
fight against biology for long enough, you end up getting to the point where you can't define what a woman is.
That's just a massive generalisation about what a male role is and what a male role isn't. Women's rights haven't gone too far because we currently don't have the right to the most basic thing, safety.
Also, I imagine a lot of people will be screaming at the television at home and saying, hang on, Joseph, we need to know what a woman is first before we can even comment, perhaps, on whether women's rights have gone too far. But thank you very much indeed, Joseph Robertson, Director at Orthodox Conservatives, as well as the author and broadcaster Amy Nicole. Thank you very much indeed. A little bit of a feisty one there. Two very, very different views. Thank you, Amy, for coming into the studio. Now, it's been another week of revelations from the Telegraph's lockdown files. A new line claimed that Simon Case warned Boris Johnson of the terrible consequences of lockdown. Fraser Nelson wrote a column this week in the Telegraph warning that unless Britain's pandemic game plan is changed, we could enter into lockdown again in the future. So do we need to change our contingency plan for a possible future pandemic? Or is lockdown actually the right policy, as some argue? Joining me now to discuss this is Angus Dalgleish, a professor of oncology, St George's Hospital Medical School. Now, if I remember rightly, Angus, you were someone who was against lockdowns pretty much from the start?
Good afternoon. I certainly was. As an oncologist, I saw from my own personal experience in the clinic that if patients were not able to come into their regular attendance, get early diagnosis and early treatment, it would be an absolute disaster. And also, as a virologist who did a lot of work in the HIV field in the early days, I recognised that the coronavirus was an airborne respiratory virus, that all the early signs, which were grossly overinterpreted, were that it was just like a cold or a flu and was affecting people who were elderly, who could easily be shielded, and that the vast majority of people would have good immune responses to it, and they didn't need lockdown, and they didn't need to be bullied into all these dreadful things like the masks being shown here, and the distancing, and the not going out. It was a disaster, and I'm very interested to see that Hancock was advised heavily against it, but his arrogance knew no bounds in order to push it. I myself commented in the Daily Mail very early on that his failure to discuss the Great Barrington Declaration, which is saying that we should do exactly what I've just said, just protect the older people, let everybody else get on with it. And I called him that this was the action of a petulant fool. And I was amazed the editor didn't moderate it. But I think I was being a bit kind in retrospect.
Is this a simple case of power corrupts?
Without doubt. I mean, it is. Hancock is a typical politician who really is only in it for his own game. He really said, this is my chance to make it big. He obviously thought he was going to be Prime Minister or something, and I'll become Mr. Vaccine. He tried to take all the credit from Kate Bingham for the vaccine programme, as we know. And Kate Bingham, the vaccine programme, was doing it just for the people most at risk, 70 and over, and those with conditions. And then that was part of the push to roll it all out to younger people, etc. He was taking the credit for doing this. I hadn't quite accepted, hadn't really quite realised just how many people had advised him of the people like myself. And Lord Sumption, I noticed, was also writing about the same time. And we could have written each other.
Angus, sorry to interrupt, but this is it, isn't it? Because I, at the time, although I was angered by the policies, frustrated, like many people, gave the government a little bit of the benefit of doubt in terms of the amount of pressure to lock down that was on them from the media, from some of the scientific community, from the public health lobby. But now we find out that there were many people who were trying to get to the ears of Matt Hancock, and he was the one who was actively pushing those away, despite the fact that he knows nothing really about public health.
No, it is an absolute disgrace, and I'm afraid the person who has to carry the can in these situations is Boris Johnson, because he appointed him. What on earth did he appoint him Health Secretary for when he has no credentials for doing that? And he was told by others, that he shouldn't lock down, and he vacillated and prevaricated, and in the end he seems to have been bullied by Hancock, and that's a terrible weakness. And just look what it's cost us. The long-term effect of lockdown is going to probably cost the country about £1 trillion pounds in the end.
Yeah. Now, Angus, sorry, we've only got time for one more question. So I must say also that Matt Hancock isn't here to defend himself, of course. But just lastly, in terms of contingency plans for future pandemics, do you agree with Fraser Nelson that it's looking like, because of a lack of any alternative planning, that it could be that lockdown is used again?
Yes, this is a very good question. The first of all is that we should not sign away all our rights to the WHO, the World Health Organization. They've shown themselves to be supremely incompetent in the way they dealt with this. Had they shown the incompetence under their previous director, then this would never have escaped China. We had the first non-clinical director who was appointed really de facto by China, who did what China told him. And it was an absolute disaster. A really strong WHO would have prevented this from happening. We've signed all our rights away that if something dreadful emerges again, and your Neil Fergusons will basically predict 1 billion people dying if you don't do this, that and the other, they may well do this lockdown again. And I think we have to take it into our own hands. We cannot have a load of, essentially, they're unelected people governing the World Health Organization who are really controlled by China and Bill Gates now. If it was a real democracy, that would be good, but it's not like that anymore. We must preserve our rights to decide ourselves and not leave it to other people who will decide the worst possible scenario and we'll lock down.
Again, I must say the WHO, of course, is also not here to defend themselves. But thank you very much indeed, Angus. Angus Dalgleish, Professor of Oncology at St George's, knows a lot about what he's talking about, I imagine. Thank you very much indeed for joining us this afternoon. Now, lots of you have been sending in your thoughts on whether the BBC were right to remove Gary Lineker from Match of the Day. Camilla said, it depends on the terms and conditions of his contract. If he violated it, then they have the right to suspend him. That's the point I was really making, actually. Glenn says, he has the right to free speech. We all have the right to free speech, but the content and words used in that free speech are the issue. But for some inexplicable reason, some people think that's OK. And Nick has to say, I thought we all supported free speech here. Yes, but the contract may get in the way of that sometimes. Thank you all for sending in your views. We've now got a poll result. We asked whether you thought the BBC was right to remove Gary Lineker from the Match of the Day. There we go on the screen. Nearly 67% of you said yes. That's 2/3, and 33% said no. Thank you very much indeed for voting. What a result. Most people think the BBC was right. It's not often that you lot think the BBC has done something good, but there you go. You've been watching Real Britain with me, Emily Carver. Thank you very much indeed for your company. This show is on every Saturday at 2 p.m. Nana's up next, but for now, I'll leave you with the weather.
Hello there, I'm Greg Dewhurst and welcome to your latest broadcast from the Met Office. We'll see rain and hail snow pushing northeastwards through the next 24 hours or so, turning breezy, but mild air is returning from the Atlantic. And we can see that in the bigger picture. We can see the oranges and yellows starting to creep in from the southwest, the blues being shunted away as we head through later Sunday into the beginning of next week. But does it last? Well, we'll see in the outlook. Through the rest of Saturday evening, we can see that band of rain across parts of Northern Ireland into northern England, pushing its way north and eastward. Some hill snow possible across the Pennines up into the mountains of Scotland. Met Office warnings in force for snow and ice, perhaps up to 10 centimetres over the Scottish mountains. Some icy stretches here, but that mild air is starting to move in from the southwest of 5 to 7 by Sunday morning. But it is a dry